Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone here to this special event. My name is Michael Cohen. I'm the director of the Studley Graduate Program in International Affairs and the Observatory on Latin America here at the New School. And it's a particular pleasure to see all of you here on our first day after spring break. It's not April Fool's. We're happy that you could come for what we think is really going to be a very special event. Is a presentation by Minister of Labor and Social Security, Carlos Tomada, with commentary from Jose Antonio Ocampo, former Undersecretary General of the UN for Economic and Social Affairs. And we're delighted that David Scobey, the Executive Dean of the New School for Public Engagement, will make the introductions and moderate a discussion. I'd just like to say a couple of things about this event. And first, I'd like to recognize the presence here of Argentina's ambassador to the United States, Cecilia Najon. Welcome. We're delighted you're here at the New School for the first time. Recently took up her office in Washington. And Jose Luis Perez Gabilondo, the Consul General here in New York, with whom we've worked very closely. I'd also like to recognize Marta Novick, the Undersecretary for Labor Studies in the Ministry of Labor in Argentina. As you know, the Observatory for Latin America has formally existed since 2006, when then Senator Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner said in our meeting here in September of 2006, we should expand the observatory on Argentina to the Observatory on Latin America to reflect the political changes in the region, with many more countries having so-called progressive governments and a new orientation to policy and politics. Since that time, we've had many events, and there's some brochures and other materials here that you can collect to see what some of these things have been. We are very proud of the fact that over these last several years, the New School has become a space for political discussion and economic and policy discussion about Latin America. And its distinguishing feature has been that Latin Americans themselves have been speaking, not mediated by the New York Times and CNN and Fox News, but rather hearing what Latin Americans have to say about the current challenges facing their countries. And for some of us as North Americans, it's also very good to think about what some of the lessons are from Latin America that might apply here. And we certainly think that's a major part of the story. In this room, we've had many wonderful such occasions, including an initial visit here by then President Nestor Kirchner in 2003 with Joe Stiglitz, a public conversation with Paul Krugman and President Kirchner, and presented by Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, also in this room, and visits by the President and Vice President of the Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, Estela Carlota and Rosa Rosenblit. Many people have been in this room. So as President Cristina has said when she's come into this room, I feel in casa. And so I'd like to welcome you here, and we're delighted that you could all be here. It's now my honor to present Executive Dean David Scobey, who's an urban historian, who's also, since joining the New School, has become very involved with us and in the whole OLA process, including going to Buenos Aires last August to be a member of the final round of the jury for the President Nestor Kirchner Fellowship. Dean Scobey.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome, bienvenidos to everyone. I want to apologize for my lack of capacity in speaking Spanish, so that's the first and last word you'll hear from me in Spanish, but you are all truly welcome here to this panel on creating jobs in a time of global crisis, lessons from Latin America. And let me just second what Mike said. about the importance and the pleasure of having these voices from Latin America, from Argentina and Colombia, and about the global crisis. Globalization is not a new process. We've been living with it for about a century and a half at least. I'm a historian of the 19th century, and I'm a historian of globalization as much as we all are living it today. But what is new, it seems to me, is that we're living through a time of globalization that is decentered, that is multi-centered, in which it's no longer the case that capital and power flow from Europe and the West to other parts of the world and extract goods and profits from those parts of the world. But rather we live in a multi-centered global system where different forms of power and economic activity and capital flow in all directions. And that process of globalization isn't just an economic process, it's an intellectual one. And whereas it might have been true 70 or 80 years ago when the New School was founded, that people thought that Europe and places like New York were the places to come to hear about economics and policy and social issues. Now intellectual capital flows from every part of the world. And here in New York and in the United States, we have as much to learn from the experience of Latin America and other parts of the world as we have our own stories to tell and interpret. And I take it that that's what's so important about the panel today, to hear about these lessons from Latin America. We're lucky to have two distinguished voices to present that experience and these ideas. Dr. Carlos Tomada is and has been the Minister of Labor and Social Security in Argentina since 2003, when he joined the cabinet of then-President Nestor Kirchner. He's an expert in labor relations, having served as a consultant and researcher and manager and professor, as well as a politician involved with labor and social security issues. He's worked for the International Labor Organization, consulted with them, the UN Development Program. He participated in the first World Summit of Labor Mediation in Washington in 1997. He was the chair of the board of the directors of the ILO in 2005 to 2006. He's a world expert on labor issues and labor mediation, and we're delighted to welcome him here. Dr. Tomada, Minister Tomada, will first speak, and then we'll hear a comment from Jose Antonio Ocampo, a professor of economics at Columbia. He served as the Minister of Economy and Minister of Agriculture in his native Colombia. He was appointed Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and later named UN Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. He's the author of many, many books and articles about economic performance in Latin America, most recently, the economic development of Latin America since independence. Welcome to both of you.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Yo, a diferencia...
Good afternoon to all. As David Scobey said, I only know one long word in English. It's the other way around. So I'm going to talk in my native language. And this is why I've chosen the possibility of reading my presentation to facilitate the work of the translators. Everything is good when you help people in their work, at least from my point of view. And after seeing those who have participated in these events, And in this space here of the new school, I see that you've decided to lower the bar a little bit, and that's why I'm very grateful for the presence of President Mr. Ocampo, so that we really meet your expectations. So I would like to say that I'm very grateful, and I'd like to give you a very brief synthesis of my presentation. I'm going to talk about the experience of how we built an economic and social model that recovers the role of the state, which does it with a heterodox point of view in economy, and also works coherently with social and labor dimensions. In this political, technical view, we're going to give precedence to the real economy over finances, and simultaneously we stimulate innovation to head towards a new productive structure with value-added and social inclusion. Besides, this new model, what we're proposing, and basing ourselves on some of our experience, we'll see how the role of the social actors is recovered, both from the working world, and I'm referring to unions and workers, as well as civil society as a whole. So it's based on this that I'm going to speak, and so now I would like to, in the first place, thank the new school for providing this space where we can develop some of the main subjects and changes of Argentina, which also show the deep transformation that Latin America is going through as a whole. And I believe that in this regard, the Observatory in Latin America, which exists in this university, allows us to reflect on this reality, which should at least be analyzed and evaluated, because it's taking into account new scenarios and new transformations. We know that we're facing new developments, of which we don't know the final result, but we know that there's enough data and evidence regarding the important changes that have been happening if we talk about models or economic models, or if we talk about different types of development. Here, I would like to personally thank Michael Cohen and Margarita Gutman for developing the observatory on Latin America, and following all of the bicentenaries that are being celebrated or are going to be celebrated in Latin America, in a very important time in our region where all of us, after 200 years, are looking at ourselves face to face. After 200 years, we once again feel that brotherhood which existed before it, which is now indispensable to be able to think in economic and social development of our region. From a southern region, which is growing, if we view it in the traditional way that we measure the GDP, the gross domestic product, we must say that it's been criticized by the commission comprised by Fitoussi, Sen, and Stiglitz. But also, it's grown from the perspective of the Human Development Index, developed by the UNDP. It also a South that's growing with the traditional method of measuring inequality, which is and how income is distributed. But I also have to say that for us, as important as this is the fact that we objectively recognize the conditions of life of our peoples, the public majorities that are involved in these processes, and a reality which is permanently changing. I'd like to thank the efforts of this academic space, as I said before, and I would like to thank the President for inviting me to a place that I'm honored to be a part of. In this same space, two of the leaders of this new reality have been present, of the new reality of Latin America, Nestor Kirchner and our President, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. I'd like to value the creation of the Nestor Kirchner scholarships, which are offered along with the San Martin University, which offers a space for permanent exchange. Permanent exchange not only with Argentina, but specifically in the academic world, in the world of ideas. I would like to say that in this space, we will be able to talk about what we did right and what the mistakes were, following a road, as the poet said, you make headway as you walk, but it's very interesting to be the protagonist or the main actor in these moments of change and of regional integration, and of being able to work with the goals of inclusion and greater equity and social conscience in a world that is more concerned trying to have a fiscal balance rather than improving the quality of life of its inhabitants. I'd also like to make a special mention. It's more than giving thanks. It's a privilege to share this table with Jose Antonio Ocampo, a relevant academic and thinker in Latin America. We all think, as the anecdote said. Michael was telling me a story about Nestor Kirchner when he visited here, and he was sharing the podium with Paul Krugman, and they introduced Nestor as a political director who does a lot of things, and Paul Krugman as a thinker. And Kirchner raised his hand and said, I think too. I also think. But there's some who think more and better. And that's a place that Ocampo occupies for me. He directed ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Just by mentioning ECLAC, it brings us memories of debates that we had a long time ago, debates that we won and lost. So an organization in which Ocampo was able to think and propose back in the 90s the problem of social expense, the distribution of income. It was a time when the consensus in Washington reigned, and thinking about collective equity was risky. I've always thought that somebody who understands and maintains, and I'm speaking in quotes, that subject socials have to be at the heart of economic goals, and close quotes, that would be somebody who certainly understands that the economy exists not just to achieve healthy financial systems, but to make headway in development with equity. And I know that these, it doesn't allow me to forget that Ocampo is saying that the economic boom in Latin America, which existed in Latin America between 2003, 2007, will not repeat itself again, and perhaps he's right. I share many of the strategies that he's proposing, specifically for the need of having a process of greater industrialization, which is competitive, with greater innovation, and we're going to talk about this further on. And I do say that even though it's probable that we're not going back to an economic boom such as the one we had, the world also had its own boom, by the by. But I do believe that we're going to be able to maintain this idea of equity and the extension of rights. And now I'd like to speak about this further on.
Where am I speaking from? It is my turn, has been my turn, to be the Minister of Work in Argentina since 10 years ago. I say this and I am impressed myself. Among the main objectives of the national government in this already very long period between 2003 and 2013, there was and there is placing employment at the center of political decisions, making up a virtuous circle of real economy. Stiglitz spoke about this. More employment allows increased consumption, and this favors investment in production, and this generates more employment. And this is how you retake the cycle. And we proved this as time went on with successive evaluations that we took, that we did. In order to see the result of this conceptual matrix, I will use a recently published note by Alejandro Rothman, an economist, that uses sources in data that does not come from government institutions, but rather tied to the opposition to the government. This paper, based on the Observatory on Argentinian Social Debt, which was quoted yesterday, by the way, in the newspaper Clarín as a source for one of its articles, that paper on the Observatory on Social Debt says the following, and I quote, the advances that took place in the last decade in Argentina are well known, and the increase of social rights, the important growth that economy experimented, the extension of public welfare, and the greater labor effort that began in order to take advantage of new opportunities for social mobility. And that's the end of the quote. What happened in Latin America in this 21st century was not just because of economic growth, and I would like to make this very clear, rather because of the role of politics, and from this, the recuperation of the state. I understand that this is lacking, for example, in Europe today. There is no political leadership that can respond to the people's demands. I think that Europe, which was the place for the great leaders of the 20th century, Churchill, de Gaulle, Brandt, Roosevelt in the United States, today leadership is lacking. When one hears important people from the intellectual point of view, from the point of view of ideas such as Stiglitz, as Ocampo, you ask yourself, why is it that even though they are heard, they are listened to, they are heard, they are not listened to? Why continue demonstrating an orthodox strategy that continues turning on strategies that are based on monetary role and the orthodox role of the central banks? Why do financial powers continue to dominate that are also those of war, of the arms race, but also social injustice, hunger, and inequality in the world? Why? Recently, the world economy has suffered different stages and cycles, first with the epicenter in the United States, then in Europe, in the framework of this globalized economy. That world economy has lost 50 million jobs. And according to the World Work Organization, it is possible that in the next year, many more millions will be lost in employment, in jobs. has humanity gone crazy? At this new stage, in most of the countries in our region, this growth stage has been used to recuperate employment, to improve distribution of income, and reduce poverty. Of course, we are far away from the parameters that Latin America knew at the time of the import substitution, and I'm talking about the middle of the 70s. For example, we can point out as an indicator that at the beginning of the 70s, the increase in regional product was a 6% per year. At the end of that decade, it was reduced to 1.5, and in the 80s, there was no growth at all in the product. The average annual growth was 3.2% in the 90s. From 2003 to 2008, in all the countries, it was between 6 and 9%. But also, we should talk about the comparison between the ways in which Latin America faced its last crisis. There you see differences too. In this last crisis that began in 2008 with the Lehman Brothers downfall, it was able to sustain it without great losses in production, growth, and employment. This was not at random. It's the product of a low level of indebtedness, the price of commodities, as we all know, but above all, because of the development of internal market and a recovery in production, not always structured or sufficiently competitive. But we have to recognize, and I think that this makes it more meritorious along the lines of what was being mentioned, in the framework of a very strong globalization, financially centralized, a globalization that is also asymmetrical because it is not the same for industrialized countries as for emerging countries. The failure of the Doha round is a clear example. In other words, to lower the taxes, yes, we agree on this, but eliminate subsidies of developed countries to activities that compete with underdeveloped countries, that is a no. Meanwhile, in developed countries, public deficit grew. But all developed countries suffered stability in social expenditures. This is why we cannot accuse state policies of being responsible for this fiscal weakness. This increase was slow, and it cannot explain the deterioration of the fiscal situation in developed countries. Maybe the explanation should be looked for in financial expansion, in the processes of sending out work to other countries. And I agree with Ocampo when he points out that globalization now requires institutions that are regularizers. There is still a lot to be done, both at regulation and institutional levels, in spite of a lot of agreements that there were at the time of the crisis. For example, in 2008, when there was talk about the need of a vigorous and stable and sustainable growth, or when it seemed that there was a predominance of the conviction that crisis will not stand until all the inhabitants of our countries recover employment, recover jobs. Nevertheless, this did not last long. It did not last long. Globalization is not in crisis. Globalization is a fact. What is in crisis is the politics of globalization. the administration of globalization, which has been and continues to be dominated by neoliberalism. But let's return to the topic of my presentation, the crisis and the response in the Argentine Republic in this framework that we have just described. In Argentina, around the middle of the 70s, public policies displaced the previous goal before the 70s of obtaining total employment. And there was subordination of labor market to the emergent requirements of modifications in the structure of the economy led by the idea of free market. And I'll make a parenthesis here. There will be behind me images. Try to do both things at once to maintain your attention on what I'm saying and look at the screen. In order to not make this very long, we will show some data so that everybody can see where we are, and we will try to make them go together, or at least we will try. Also, I'd like to tell you that if later on there is time for questions and answers, if anybody wants to write down anything about what we have on the images, then we'll go back to them when we have the question and answer period. And so we were talking about how there is a profound change in public policies towards the middle of the 70s. As a result of this, indicators of unemployment climbed to unheard of levels, while the more relevant activities underwent a severe destructurization process when it came to do with production. The maximum expression of this policy was in the 90s in our country. This model, which was centered on deregulation and the decrease of the presence of the state with labor deregulation, ended in a crisis that was political, economic, social, and institutional in 2001, a crisis that we had never seen before in such dimension. When we look now at the data on Greece and Spain, we see them as familiar. And we know that we never want to go back to that point. We also should remember that in terms of our context, the situation that we lived in our country took place in a country that from the middle of the 20th century had known the greatest levels of equality in Latin America, a country where there was almost total employment with a relative high public employment, universal coverage for health from the public system, and a public education that allowed a lot of social mobility. That Argentina is the one that, after the military coup on 24th of March of 1976, began to be lost. And so now we begin now to build it again, because this is the point, to bring back the country, to make it stand up again, and to understand what we did from 2003. We have to understand the meaning of work, the idea of work in Argentina, to tie it together and analyze it in a greater framework and multidimensional framework, where we should say that around work and acting mutually on one another in a very unorthodox way, macroeconomic policies, international commerce policies, industrialization, and technological policies. And here we agree with what the ECLAC pointed out. and I quote, in a recent work that is called The Time of Equality, where work is analyzed as the most evident manifestation of the quality of the process of economic and social development. It has to do with social cohesion. It has to do with the distribution of income. In fact, it has to do with domestic equality in the home, in family life. Also, the quality of employment has another dimension and transcendence because it connects us with productivity, with the qualification of work. The main debt that Latin America had was the social debt. At the beginning of the 21st century, I think that without doubt that the main debt that Latin America had was the social debt. On the face of this, governments that began at that time took a similar position, maybe unorthodox, responding to their own histories, to their own traditions, to their own degrees of development. Argentina did it through employment, and above all, through employment on record with social protection. For us, from the very beginning, employment was the center and the axis of public policies. With a fiscal and commercial surplus, it was obviously easier. But also, when the crisis was deepened in 2008, steps also were taken to preserve jobs. Employment, and I will not repeat it too often, is a source of inclusion, of identity, of income, of improvement in the distribution of personal and functional income, and fundamentally a giver of citizenship and a factor of development. Although social policies and welfare policies have a central role in the way in which economic growth is distributed in society, the retribution for work continues to be the main source of income for people. And therefore, the level and the inequalities that are generated there will be central to the evolution of the total distribution of income and in the search for equality. In this regard, given this dimension, there is a central role to be played at the time of thinking of strategies for sustainable development. As many times President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner has pointed out, we have been since 10 years ago the experience of focusing the political macro and micro politics and understanding that self-regulating markets and that neoliberal thought talks about do not work in any ways in which theory points them out. And I say it because they do not ensure investment, these are self-regulated markets. They do not optimize costs and prices. They do not ensure competitiveness and much less employment. Employment and income do not constitute dependent dimensions on what happens in macroeconomics, as the orthodox paradigm points it out, but rather they are part of that same macroeconomics together with fiscal and monetary policies. This is the idea. It isn't that there are two macroeconomic politics and some are subordinate. For us, within macroeconomic policies, there is in parity of importance if we want economies and sustainable systems of development. We want all three policies, of course, the policy of income, of fiscal and exchange at the same level when it comes to making decisions. What we I'm sorry, when I'm talking about income policies, it is understood that I'm talking about salaries, jobs, and welfare. Those are the three components of the policies of incomes. What we started after 2003 was a coordinated system, coherent system of policies bringing together growth with social inclusion, where work was constituted in the main factor for that inclusion. Macroeconomic policies, at that time the main ones were the type of exchange, and the retention to exports, and getting rid of debts. And these three macroeconomic policies brought about a change in the social plan that was at work at that moment, a transfer of income that was present for 2,300,000 people on a basis for work insertion. When Kirchner became president, Ministry of Work was the administrator of that plan. This shows what work was in Argentina. It had disappeared. The main thing was the social plan, not work. The strategy was then to go from a social policy to a labor policy, because that is the role of a Ministry of Work, a Ministry of Employment and Social Security. First, the beneficiaries of the plan were separated between those who were closer to a social plan because of their vulnerability, women with many children, situations of vulnerability, and these became the object of the actions of the Ministry of Development, and the others were subject to the employment policies and formation policies. In other words, the reinsertion in the labor market was aimed at. This was to strengthen internal demand from provinces, from the different regions in our country. Consumption then was recreated first in small and medium-sized localities, and then in urban areas. And this reactivated demand and generated more employment. And there was a stimulus to the work climate, generating micro companies and cooperatives, and then giving support to companies in difficulties little by little, little by little. I always remember that 48 hours after Nestor Kirchner taking the presidency, I meet with them to see what we were going to do in those first days. And when the meeting ends, we are walking towards the door, and Kirchner says to me, look, Carlos, what I ask you is just one thing. It is that every day, every single day, you do something small or medium-sized or big, a resolution, an action, something that will lead to the improvement of the lives of our people. If you every day, but absolutely every day, you do something, you will see that when 2 or 3 years go by, we will again look at Argentina, and for sure we will see a country that will look a lot more to the country that we always dreamed of. And of course, this is how it was. This idea of every day doing something, to improve the quality of life of the inhabitants of our country. And so when it came to employment, we went from 23% of unemployment in 2002 to 7% in 2012. And then at the end of 2006, in other words, in 3 years from that 23%, we were in 1 digit.
And it's interesting to note this, because all of the studies at the time, the ones that were more apparent in the press and in what the economists said, determined that Argentina was going to need more than 10 or 15 years to lower its unemployment to one digit, 10 to 15 years. Of course, they were right. It would have been right if they kept on following with the growth model which existed before. But this is what the policies did in Argentina. When they changed the growth model and they based it on the increase of internal demand and on promoting exports because of the exchange rate and making it autonomous in its decisions, its economic decisions, not only did they change an economic trend, but they changed the lives of millions of Argentine citizens. Work institutions took on a new meaning. The Council for Salary, recovering minimum wages, which served to, in a tripartite way, set along with the employers and unions, a minimum wage which met workers' needs. Collective bargaining, which in a never-before-seen dynamics grew year by year, both in the agreements they reached and in the amount of workers that were covered by the collective bargaining. The growth of registered work or formal work was unprecedented, and a fight with the heterogeneous policies, because the reality is heterogeneous. We applied various policies to the different levels of informal work, and that allowed us to go back to more formal jobs. There was a large investment in training and certifying competencies of the workers and helping people to finish their studies. That was absolutely necessary. All of this affected the presence and the actions of the labor unions and workers, which once again became main social actors. There was another debt that was paid, a debt which had left the curbside economy and the precariousness and the poverty of the neoliberal model, which was to pardon provisionally, have a provisional pardon for all of those who were about to retire and who didn't have the necessary age to retire, but that they were able to get some kind of pension. This policy broadened the coverage of 76% of people over 65 years to 95% at present. Today, 95% of people who are over 65 years have access to a retirement pension. This also stimulated aggregate demand because certain sectors were included which had been delayed unjustly by dismantling the state and the absence of the responsibility of the business sector when facing social responsibility. And these are some of the results. They're just some of the results. Very good, Marta. Registered employment grew, the informal sector dropped, productivity increased, and besides, as the slide number 5 says, real income increased. We broadened coverage for workers through negotiated contracts and collective bargaining, and we systematically increased the number of collective bargaining contracts. But in 2008, the international crisis appears. Then we also had to make new decisions in our macroeconomic policies, social policies, and employment. We clearly and decisively opted for a policy of preservation and maintaining existent employment through counter-cyclic policies and subsidies which guaranteed that we were not going to lose jobs. I remember that back then, in September of 2008, the President of the nation calls this idea of the impact of the financial crisis which might affect Argentina was already taking hold. And of course, in Argentina, we had seen the way crises were always answered. You had to make adjustments and then more adjustments. However, when I went into the president's office, and the president, without even asking me to sit down, says to me, "Carlos, we can't touch jobs. We're going to defend jobs even when facing this international crisis." This had never happened in Argentina, never before. Also, based on the premise, which is historically confirmed, that social security is not the privilege of rich nations, but that countries are rich also based on having social security, and especially extended welfare. We took another fundamental step. Of course, a step contrary to the recipes which had been applied in our region in the 90s and today in Europe. We strengthened social security by recovering state management of welfare funds, and we had transcendental changes. Based on the law, we granted mobility. Based on the law, we granted greater coverage, and we also set up a universal fee per child. In the context of that crisis, the universal assignation per child, which means a direct transfer to parents for every single child and every single adolescent up to 18 years of age. So we tried in that way, in the same way that we went from welfare policies to labor policies. From here we went from social policies to granting rights. The right of having health care and education, because it's a necessary condition for this universal assignation, and this is what's important, recovering rights. A recent survey of protection and social security that we carried out at the Labor Ministry shows the very broad coverage that we have achieved, which corroborates a process of universal rights for children. To make it clear, this coverage for children in social coverage went from the end of the 90s from 37% to 86%. Then on the other hand, another survey that we carried out jointly with the National Commission to eradicate child labor shows that there was a significant reduction of child labor, which went from 6% dropping to 2.5%. And this didn't happen by accident. This is because of 10 years of work. It's because we evaluated, corrected, and carried forward these policies of social inclusion and equality. The cost of the set of policies applied in the 2008-2009 crisis to maintain productivity and employment, along with those of social protection, welfare, and direct transfers, was about 3% of the GDP. But here I have to point something out. Specifically, the universal policies with the universal allowance per child assigned more than what Brazil and Mexico granted in their Bolsa Familia and Opportunities programs, respectively, programs that have been recognized in international fora. Argentina wanted more. Of course, not everything is rosy. The crisis didn't come to an end, but rather it's just gone into a new stage. The center of the crisis spread towards Europe, and instead of the anti-cyclical policy agreements which had begun at the beginning, then austerity policies began to be applied, and we very well know how they're going to end. In spite, of course, of recognizing that we're dealing with countries that have another level of development at the economic and industrial levels. But we know how these policies are going to end. In Europe in the last few years, the political strategy changed its priorities, drawing away from taking care to create more employment and concentrating itself on reducing fiscal deficits. The President of the U.S. always stresses, your President always says, that there was a greater concern for saving the banks than for saving the people. And I think that that statement is right on the ball. Meanwhile, in Argentina, there's also less economic growth in 2012. It was approximately 2% or under 2%, after having grown at an average of 8 or 9% for many years. But we hardly lost jobs. Productivity had increased significantly before that, and the policy for growing the internal markets and for substituting imports are generating the growth of some sectors and keeping our jobs. To give you an example, the sector that had the greatest relative growth in every regard, even in employment, is the computing sector. There's a great deal to do. We're certain that we have a long way to go. But even though we have things that are right and some mistakes, when we think the road that we've taken both in production and social inclusion, the results are significant. They're substantial. Let me state it this way. With a population of 40 million of Argentines, Argentina has 40 million citizens. 12 million acquired new rights. The people who entered the workforce, especially into the formal sector, people who had jobs, children, because their parents were working, had a family allowance, the 3.5 children who received the universal allowance, the 2.5 million of elderly people who receive retirement pension or a pension that they never imagined, and 1 million of welfare pensions, both with the necessary medical coverage. This means that 12 million Argentine citizens, 26% of the total population of Argentina, today has rights. Rights that they didn't have on May 24th, 2003. This important reduction in inequality, according to the Gini index, which has been registered in the last few years in Argentina, is explained in the generation of 60% of decent employment, employment with social protection, formal employment. 60% of an improvement of the Gini index is due to employment and to income, and 25% is due to the effect of the social protection policies, welfare policies. This shows that the impact that these tools that have been implemented have had. Trying to draw to a close, I want to say that in the last 3 months, just in the last 3 months, in spite of this critical situation that we're going through, there are 3 new laws destined to protecting the most vulnerable citizens were approved. Laws which grant rights to people who were disenfranchised, laws have generated the resistance of the interests in the status quo, even though they were unanimously approved by Parliament. There are 3 laws. They're the following. The first is penalizing businessmen when they use child labor. Before, we had increased the age of people who are entering the workforce. We went from 14 to 16. This is for Alberto. He's very familiar with this subject. 2, the work law for rural workers, where the workers who participate in one of the activities of the greatest wealth in Argentina, these workers didn't have the same rights as the rest of the workers. 80% of these workers are not registered. Even today in Argentina, there are situations of slavery, work slavery, in the 21st century, which are now no longer tolerated. And with a law that was just passed, which is heading in the direction, because work slavery can't be called work, and it's going to mean that it's going to disappear in our country. 3, the law of people who work in their homes. They're usually called servants or maids, which is a collective group. It's not only numerous, because it is, but we're also talking about a gender policy. 89% of these workers are women, but it's also a fact of social justice when facing the process of migrations. More than half of the workers in private homes in Argentina were born in the countries or other countries of Latin America. And it meant bringing about justice, and it was totally unjust that any democratic government throughout all of these years had not sanctioned a law to protect these workers. These 3 laws, which cover the last 2 groups and cover more than 2 million people, have just been approved. I'm almost at the end of my presentation, as people say when they look at the faces in the audience. Just 5 more minutes and I'll reach a close. I said at the beginning of my comments that we had to act along 2 lines simultaneously: social debt and production. We're working, and I'm certain that the Argentine ambassador to the United States is in a better capacity to talk about this. That's why I'm only going to mention it. We're working, trying to strengthen a matrix which changes an economy which is based exclusively on natural resources by intensifying process for complex production, ensuring that innovation and knowledge are at the center. Not only by talking about it, by creating the Ministry of Science and Technology, bringing back hundreds of scientists that had left the country, creating 10 new state universities throughout the country, having greater public-private synergy in technological innovation. We're undergoing a process of reindustrializing the Argentine economy. We have to build a capital goods market. We have to generate and develop chains of value with high added value, which require quality employment, continue improving the competencies and training of businessmen and workers. That's how we're trying to improve competition, because our country already tried to be competitive by lowering salaries and having worse working conditions. We know that it's absolutely necessary for competition to take the high road through technological innovation, training, and improving our workers. But it's not easy. It's clear that there are powerful sectors which are opposed to these policies, and it's logical. We've learned that the problem isn't always bad management. Very often it's due to bad ideas. I don't know if, as Ocampo says, we won't have the economic growth that we had at the beginning of the 21st century. But there are two factors which I'd like to stress which explain the recent processes in Latin America, and specifically in the case of Argentina. One is the political decision which goes back to the old values and rights which were expensive and important for the Argentine people, such as work, health, and education, but also the new rights. The law for equal marriages, the right and access to social communication, and the defense of human rights. The historic values, the ones which existed in the collective mind, the collective conscience of the people of Argentina, which never stopped being there in spite of these last 30 years, as well as the new rights. And the other factor which explains this is that when people acquire rights, they fight to defend them.
Nacionales.
From democracy to international identities, each country its own. They may be mistaken, these elites that try to appropriate that which is not theirs and their own. People fight for their symbols and their rights. Margarita well knows what in reality and symbolically meant the celebration of the bicentennial. It was to recuperate history. Definitely, Latin America and great part of emerging countries are slowly changing the configuration of the world as we know it. We know that there is a lot to be done in development, both economic and social. We are alert to that deficit that we cannot help but recognize. We evaluate our advances and difficulties and we adapt our instruments. We know that always the achievements of equality, justice, and human rights are insufficient. They always are insufficient, but they always depend on the convictions and political will to reach them. Our political project is by definition as a democratic project, a project that is never ending, but where we have achieved we have gotten achievements in local, in social conditions that nobody can deny. From that point, I invite us all to dare to imagine, to innovate in this too. Let us dare to construct a world with more equity, with fewer inequalities, with fewer banks, and more happiness. Thank you very much. In a poll that I took here, visually, there was a majority of people who understand Spanish, so I will use my language. I'd like to begin by thanking Michael Cohen from the Observatory for this invitation to be here to comment on Minister Tomada's presentation, his kindness in his words toward me, and also to thank the Dean and to celebrate the presence of the ambassador and the Argentine consul. I'd like to begin remembering 2 points that the minister made with regard to a couple of contributions of mine. The first one I should say is the emphasis on social indebtedness and on rights as a framework to overcome problems of social debt. Meaning that, that's the second document, because the first document of ECLAC of 2000, which is called Equity, Citizenship, and Development, was able to rescue this topic of rights as the axis for any kind of formulation of social policy. And I'd like to return to this later on, because I think that we have advanced in this area, both in the face of international organizations. And the second one is this observation that I've been writing on for several years, and that maybe it'll be a reality one day, and that is that social goals should be at the center of economic policy. Until they are not at the center of economic policy, there are serious problems, let's say, in reaching them. I should also point out the many virtues of the Argentine model when it comes to social welfare and employment, and maybe to add to what the minister said, it would be worthwhile to look over the Commitment to Equity document of Inter-American Dialogue from Tulane, which is now directed by Nora Lustig, because that project that you've been discussing, this universal allowance per child in Argentina, appear to be as the most better policies for redistribution in Latin America. So I think that we should underline this. And I also pointed out, because when we wrote that document in 2000, this principle that universality is the best type of social policy, and I would say the best focalization is a universal policy, was anathema. And so I am glad to hear that some of these concepts over time have been gaining ground, with some problems that I also will refer to in order to delve a little more into this debate. In any case, since I am a macroeconomist, and that's my variant, let's say, I do have some obsessions, that macroeconomic obsessions, that I will mention as I continue with my presentation. Basically, I like to make 2 points. One, on what's happened in the job markets in Latin America, which is very similar to what the minister was showing, except that in Argentina, the contrast is much greater than in practically any other Latin American country. And around this, to look at some uncertainties, and also refer to 2 topics that appear a lot in the debate on labor policies, and one which I think is very relevant for Argentina, which is the debate on the rate of exchange, and others that have to do a little bit with the topic of informality and contributions to welfare. And I think that this is a debate and there is some lag, and I consider that need to be improved on. So the first one, let's talk about the contrast between what happened in labor markets in Latin America. And I don't want to go back to the middle of the 70s, let's say the economic liberalization, which began in South America much before than in the rest of Latin America, but then it became generalized around the middle of the 80s. But let's say after the debt crisis was overcome and the process of growth was reinitiated, what we have seen in Latin America are 2 periods that are quite different in labor and distribution and therefore in the distribution of wealth, and something that happens in labor markets and what happens in other elements of distribution of income. And so in the 90s, there is a beginning again of the growth process in Latin America, but labor markets continue to behave in a totally adverse way. And that tendency becomes more acute with the crisis of the end of the 20th century, the crisis that begins, let's say, in 98 or arrives in Latin America in 98. The crisis began in Asia in 97. And what one can observe is a graph that was not here, let's say, but it was very similar to what happened in Argentina, of a reduction in the rate of employment even during the period of economic growth. And there was an increase in unemployment. And associated with this, a third phenomenon, which was the increase in the informal work, and that became totally generalized. And so those of us who have analyzed the period came to the conclusion that liberalization of markets cannot be alien to that result, because of this anomaly that, in fact, the growth of the market stopped generating employment, because also the reduction in employment it was caused in the sectors that are more affected by liberalization, that is in manufacturing and agriculture, sectors that had to compete with imports in a greater way. In contrast with this, the period that began, let's say, in 2003, maybe in 2002 in some countries, and that ended before the crisis, and the international crisis of 2008, is a period of recovery, of growth, but above all, of a recovery that is very vigorous in all labor indicators. In other words, the rate of employment that was going down suddenly changes in direction. The rate of unemployment falls down, and informality falls down, and real salaries began to recover. This period, let's say, has many aspects that one could note regarding this behavior. But I share with the minister the vision that what has happened with internal markets, because of the improve in labor market, the improvement in distribution that has been seen in several countries in Latin America, and the vertical fall of poverty that fell more than 10% between 2002 or 2003 and 2007, and it is the greatest reduction of poverty in the history of Latin America. You can analyze the 70s or periods before that, and there was never a reduction in poverty as fast and as marked as during that period. I think that there is an effect of a virtuous circle that in fact has been generated because of this conjunction of phenomena, and that without doubt, I think, has to do with the internal market, with the dynamics of the internal market, which is a product of that improvement in distribution and employment. And it also becomes a source that encourages economic activity. And I think that the recent deceleration has occurred not only in Argentina, but for example in Brazil. It surprises and that labor indicators continue to be extraordinarily positive in spite of the deceleration that has been going on. And I think that has to do with the internal market and makes part of this history. And we should say that all the analyses that have been done on liberalization of labor markets show during the period of liberalization that a topic was much less central. In fact, one of the criticisms that were made from certain areas is that Latin America has not liberalized its labor market sufficiently, and I say fortunately. We didn't do it anymore because the steps to liberalization were really a disaster in the way they happened. At least in my country, the steps of liberalization all ended up in reducing formal employment without creating additional employment. And what is also very interesting and is a great contrast with the history that the minister was telling us about in several Latin American countries is the much active use of minimum wage as an instrument of economic policy. The minimum wage is growing in almost every country, and in all the analyses that have been done on Brazil come to the conclusion that the minimum wage increase is perhaps the clearest element in the distribution that has been seen in Brazil. But it's a much more general tendency, and in some countries, not in all of them, we also have had what the minister mentioned, which is the strengthening of unionism, of three-part or two-part negotiations that had disappeared. All of that reversion of tendencies when it comes to labor matters, I think is part of that history, but I would underline the question of the policies towards minimum wage and, in general, this topic of internal markets. Now, as the minister said, I am a little skeptic as to whether this very good situation will continue over time. And I have noted that what happened from the time of the international financial crisis is a couple of phenomena that are worrisome. One is the deceleration of growth. Let's say there is an initial recession after the collapse of Lehman Brothers that affects some countries more than others, dramatically Mexico, but also Brazil and others. In the case of Argentina, there is no recession, but there is a very strong deceleration, and let's say everywhere. There is no Latin American economy that does not decelerate after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. There was later a recovery, but we have seen in the last 2 years is that this process lost its impulse, and that the economic growth that we have had, let's say after 2008, has been on average in Latin America 3.3%. And in reality, that is the same growth that we had in the 90s, which is a growth that is clearly insufficient and clearly below what Latin America should be growing. And the second phenomenon that will lead me to my macroeconomic observations is what is happening with the rates of exchange. And it has to do concretely, maybe a little less in Argentina than in others, with the pressures that are being generated by international financial markets. And that the Minister of the Treasury in Brazil properly described as the war of currency. It's a little dramatic, but it's nevertheless true. What happens in reality is that with the reduction in the deficit, in the commercial deficit in the U.S., the European recession that causes balances in the entire periphery of Europe in commerce are reduced dramatically, and in fact have sustained in Germany, or the surplus have increased in some countries such as Holland. In other words, in all of Europe there is a pressure to a better external balance, and on top of that there is a boom in oil, which makes oil countries generate a surplus. And so since the world, we negotiate among us, until now there is no commercial trade with Mars or Jupiter, when there are countries that tend to improve their external accounts, there are others who have to deteriorate their external accounts, and that's us. In other words, there's a pressure in the world adjustment that is forcing economies in development that are non-oil to generate increasing deficits. And the way that they are generated is essentially through pressure from capital markets and the revaluation of the rates of exchange, and which is a generalized reality nowadays in Latin America. And so here there is an interesting problem, let's say, that has to do or where Latin America is a victim of the way in which international adjustments are taking place, and which is weakening our capacity for growth, and which was stopped this vigorous recovery that we had after the crisis, and that continues to affect us. I say this to go to a point. Well, to finish with that, I think that the question of the rate of exchange is important. It's a topic that in Argentina, where they also fell behind a little bit, that also endanger these process of industrialization that you very well have chosen. In Brazil has happened as well, where there is a very aggressive policy of industrialization, where in fact industry has had a lot of difficulties in order to position itself anew. And so this leads us to the topic of the goals of central objectives, where you have taken some actions which I have defended for quite a while, where we have to move, and we have not yet won the battle with this obsession on inflation is the unique goal of central banks, and its worst case in the world is the European Central Bank. But that we too, in many countries, copied very closely, beginning with Chile, but also my country, Colombia, and many, Argentina too, and many others that placed the objective of inflation as the only goal of central banks. And I should remember that the central bank of this country, the Federal Reserve, has three goals, which are, the first one says maximum employment. That's the first goal of the central bank of this country. The second one is in moderate inflation, and the third one is, this is interesting and almost, it is almost not known, it is moderate rates in the long term. This is an economic process. This is in order to foment growth, economic growth. And so in Latin America, I would change the last goal, and that would be the rate of exchange, because I think for us, which are very susceptible economies to the shocks caused by the balance of payment, the rate of exchange really plays a very central role. And I think that what happened in Argentina after the moratorium of the debt, and after what you had a rate of exchange that was very competitive through a lot of years, and it was something that led to economic growth. In other words, the savings in the currency generated by the moratorium improved the fiscal situation, joined to a rate of exchange that was very competitive. And I think that this was the part of the secret of the rapid growth that you had, let's say, after 2004. In Argentina.
Therefore, macroeconomy is important, and here I think that we have some very important signs, are like the yellow light, the stoplight. And then the last thing, and I'll end here, it has to do with this thesis that perhaps is a contrast to what you've done, but which continues to exist in some of the visions that international banks have, and I think it's of great concern. And I have to say that there's an interesting trend in international banks. One day I was at a forum at the IDB, and there was an economist from the World Bank, and he was presenting all of these ideas that they're proposing about the middle classes, and one of the interesting conclusions is that Latin America has to go from a policy of being focalized and being universal to increase the middle class. And I said, welcome to ECLAC, welcome to ECLAC. That's what we've been saying for over 10 years. And you've just only understood it very well. But next to that, there's also an idea which exists out there, and it's important because in my country it was one of the central elements of a tax reform that happened last year. It's the idea that the curbside economy, the informal economy, is linked to contributing to Social Security. So the way that we have to reform the labor markets is basically trying to reduce contributions to Social Security and substitute them by tax transfers. Tax transfers are important. They're important in many of your programs and in all social policies all over the world. They're important. But there's one thing which is very clear. When you compare Latin America with the OCDE countries, it's that we have a tax structure. We have an excess of indirect taxation. We have a very large deficit in direct taxes, especially taxes to the individuals, and we have an even greater tax deficit when we talk about contributing to Social Security. So welfare states can't be built without contributing to Social Security. And that's the main mistake, the outstanding mistake of that vision, which I also believe ignores what information is telling us, and that I began with in my presentation. The trends in the informal sector come from the macro economy. It's not the way, they don't come from the way the work markets are regulated. The informal economy in Latin America has dropped with the same regimes which existed before of contributing to Social Security. So I don't think that the contributions to Social Security are a basic problem. I think that what's going to happen in practice is that we're going to end up with a system with minimum benefits covered by our general budgets, which is not the type of universal policy that I've been fighting for, and that I think that with a great deal of satisfaction you've been able to apply in Argentina. Thank you very much.
I'm going to invite questions in just a second. While I do a little bit of housekeeping about that, I'll first, Carlos, if you would like to make any reply to the comments, then let me invite questions from the floor. And Mandy, if I could ask you to bring the microphone to questioners. And Mike or Mandy, do we need to remind people to sign a permission form if they ask questions? So if you do stand up, which we want to encourage, all your thoughts and comments and questions, see that woman after the end of the conversation, because we want to have permission to display your question when we put this on the video on the internet. So responses, thoughts, questions? Wait until we have a microphone to you. Just a minute. We're just getting a microphone for you. Yes. Thanks for being patient.
First of all, of course, I'd like to offer my thanks. I don't know if the minister can hear me. It's a pleasure for those of us who are outside to be able to get so much information, which is really lacking here, to have this informative voice. My question is, if there's a possibility and there's sectors that are working in co-ops for the distribution and consumption, which lead to having the prices of food drop, and the difficulty that we have so that these basic commodities, the food, have lower prices for the population at large. And combined with this, it's a legislation regarding the statute for the workers. That's a sector that's really been abandoned. Nobody said that it happened in 1976. The first thing that they did was come out with this law. In other words, eliminate it. And in Argentina, neither is it spoken about the fact that this law exists. There's sectors that don't bring it up. Also, for those of us who are outside, we're interested both from the point of view of labor and investment that there's a greater communication, because here there are people who want to cooperate, who want to help out, but they don't know how. There are Argentines who make a small investment in a province and in some other sector, and they want to ensure that there's more work because of this, but they don't know how to go about it. And then the last thing is to say that this is a very special scenario. We're in a very privileged environment, but when you leave here and you go out on the street, you find sectors that say exactly the opposite of what's being said here. I'm talking about the law for the media and other laws. That's very unfortunate, and that's very difficult for the country. So then the subject of the co-ops, the cooperatives, and the statute for the worker.
Thanks so much. So why don't we
Entonces, ¿por qué no
take just a few questions?
tomamos varias preguntas y luego
Mr. Tomada, to respond.
le pedimos al ministro Tomada?
Mi pregunta está relacionada con...
Hello. My question is related to how sustainable are these policies that Argentina has been following of keeping employment and continuing with their social programs? And Professor Ocampo mentioned some macroeconomic obstacles, but at the internal level in the country, where do the resources come from to finance these social programs? And in the future, how are you going to continue obtaining these resources? I'd like to understand the internal dynamics of the country. Thank you.
Yes, there's a hand back there. The gentleman.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and particularly for laying out different elements of both social and employment policy. One area, there's a group of people increasingly, I know you may be aware of the case in India, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, and the Jefes program in Argentina in the early years of this century, which you alluded to, is often cited as one type of employment guarantee program. So my question is, what are your thoughts about the viability, the feasibility of employment guarantee is an element of either social, and that's also a question, whether it's a social or an employment labor policy. Thank you.
Ministry, do you want to?
Okay.
I'll ask the minister to respond to those questions, and then we'll take some more.
Okay.
One.
The Argentine plan kept up or was held up for 10 years. Why don't they continue with it for 10 more years when the rest of the world is doing so badly and Argentina is being brutally attacked by the financial sectors, the international financial sectors, which are called the markets, and which I simply say that they're speculators. They play poker, betting on the luck of peoples of the world. That's one point. The other point is that in our countries, we certainly have enemies of our country that defend these interests. And in Europe, it's a scandal what's happening in Spain and other European countries. We were always criticized that our Latin American societies are corrupt. That we're corrupt, we're bad pupils. They're bad pupils. Their wealth always meant our poverty. So finally, we can really lift our heads somewhat. And we can say, social expense is not an expense, it's the best investment that a society can have to progress, to move forward. That's it. And I'd like to say other things that haven't been said here. The possibility that the countries in Latin America have to have a common market within the Latin American countries themselves. In Asia, the interregional market is over 50%. In Latin America, we have an exchange of 15%, limited to 15%. So there's an enormous possibility there of improving trade and of growing together and not being afraid. If we had a bad year last year, it's because of the crisis that was not produced by the Latin American countries. That's all. That's it, and we may have reached something.
Minister Tomada, did you want to respond to these questions?
Sí. Vamos a venir más seguido acá.
Yes, I will answer. We're going to come here more often. Let's see what some of the concrete questions are. There was a question of the cooperatives. Argentina in the last few years has created a cooperative system which is broader. What happens is that there's this internal tension as to what the role of the cooperatives is. They're very virtuous cooperatives which make the cooperative movement in Argentina, regionally and all over the world, proud. And there's certain cooperatives that are used for labor fraud and placing workers in a weaker situation. In spite of that, I have to say that the space for a social economy in Argentina has grown larger. Today, without even forming part of the central nucleus of the productive process, today the social economy, which began to grow as a way to get out of the crisis, at present occupies a place which is linked specifically to providing services and tries to substitute public employment, and it's also linked to burgeoning public jobs as a first step to turning into small companies or even medium-sized companies in the system, in the collective system. But to synthesize, I'd like to say, you have to create a good environment for investment, but sometimes that damages other people. But I hear that we have a good environment to strengthen and to favor cooperatives in Argentina. Let's put it that way. As to the worker law, or the agrarian workers or rural workers, the person who's been the promoter of that law has very clear that the last law in effect had the signature of Videla Martínez de Osa and Arguibey, And that it's been placed in one of the whereases of the law, because we can't forget, in the same way that we can't forget, but we do have to reflect on the fact that 30 years of democracy, which fortunately we're going to celebrate this year, 30 years of democracy. In those 30 years, we didn't take the time to take care of the rural workers. Let's hope that in the next 30 years, the rural workers will gain greater equality.
With regard to the topic, I was asked about the question of guaranteeing employment, the questions related to the different programs. I'd like to say to you that first I'd like to answer, and then the other question regarding sustainability. And the anecdote that I gave you with the president of our country, where she says we are not going to sacrifice jobs because of the crisis, was of course an order from the president, so that in the period of 24 hours, I was to present to her a policy proposal to guarantee employment. That is, not permit the free functioning of markets obviously generated collective dismissals, which is what usually happens in these crises, and to allow the dismissals to take place. And then when the economy recovers, these workers again get their jobs. But rather, the proposal was totally different. It was, let us defend the labor sector. Let us make the effort to sustain this labor relation. Because if this is a crisis, if we keep the labor relation, we maintain the worker with its skills, with their abilities, and then the exit out of the crisis will be quicker, precisely because we are not going to have these bottlenecks, which we did have when we exited the crisis in 2001. And I should say, and I don't have the graph right here, that at the outcome, the exit from the crisis of 2008 and 2009, as Ocampo pointed out, was much quicker and much more vigorous than the exit from all the crises before. And normally, in order to return to a job situation, previous to the crisis, it took us between 3 and 4 years. And at this time, with the crisis of 2008 and 2009, at the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, in other words, in 1 year, and there was a recovery of all employment on record that had been lost during the crisis, during that crisis. And why is this? For us, because of a series of factors, because Argentina was a solider country, because policies had been deployed for that, but also because there was a policy to defend employment, which consisted on a subsidy that was given to workers to maintain their tie to the company. In other words, the company in crisis received money for each worker, and that allowed it to subsist during a crisis that was short. And so this means that what I want to say to you is that we will always have in our idearium, in our imaginations, in our creativity, there will always be the guarantee of employment, because it is important in this model. Now, the question was, where do resources come from? Well, some of them from the retention of imports. For example, Argentina, on the other hand, has a level of evasion that was a product of deliberate policies to facilitate eluding fiscal and welfare responsibilities, and this is being modified, and this And the convictions and technology have a lot to do with this. Now we can focus with fiscal intelligence and technological intelligence, many sectors that very often made tax evasion something natural. And I'm not talking about the little businessmen. I'm talking about the large companies, serial companies in the world, a lot of mining companies, companies that we believe should contribute to this collective effort. There are other ways where resources can still be added to a continuity of active policies in favor of employment that Argentina wants to continue to have. Of course, without forgetting the things that Ocampo told us about. I should add that after his statements with regard to social loans, I should make a statement in favor of my colleague Campos.
It's now 5 o'clock, and I think time to bring this to an end. I want to thank Minister Tomada and Professor Ocampo, and also the Ambassador and the Consul General for being here. The Minister said at the start of his last answer that he needs to come more often, and we agree. We want him to come very often. I know I speak for Mike and Marga and my President, David Van Zandt. So thank you both very much.